Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today on Channels Television. Let's continue with positive news coming from Sudan, where the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, the two warring factions in Sudan, have agreed to a 7-day ceasefire. Earlier, the warring rivals agreed to send representatives for negotiations, potentially in Saudi Arabia. And that's according to the United Nations Special Representative in the country, Volker Perthes. Mr. Perthes said talks will initially focus on establishing a stable and reliable ceasefire monitored by national and international observers. He also added that the two sides had already named their representatives for preliminary discussions, but cautioned that logistics for talks were still being worked out. The two sides announced late on Sunday that they will abide by a 72-hour extension of their nominal ceasefire of the past week, but explosions and sounds of gunfire were reported in parts of Khartoum and its neighboring city, Omdurman, on Monday. Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Sorki said that he met with an envoy for Sudan's Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan today in Cairo, as fighting between the Sudanese Army and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces continues for a third week. The fighting that erupted on April the 15th has brought airstrikes and artillery battles to Khartoum and its adjoining cities of Omdurman and Bahri, emptying the streets of civilian life. Egypt says that 40,000 Sudanese have crossed its border. A United Nations refugee official adds that more than 100,000 refugees have now crossed from Sudan to neighboring countries to escape the conflict that erupted last month. Two planes carrying evacuees from Sudan touched down in South Africa's Oliver Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg over the past weekend. The airport saw crowds of family members waiting for the evacuees and gave emotional hugs to show how relieved and happy they were about the safe return of their beloved ones. Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, welcomed the second batch of 51 returnees to the airport on Sunday, saying that she prayed for the conflict in Sudan to end at an early date. The returnee recounted his terrible experience in Sudan after fierce armed clashes erupted on April the 15th. The deadly clash between the Sudanese army and the RSF has killed at least 528 people and wounded 4,599 others.
I'm happy and I'm thanking South Africa, the government, the media, everyone that assisted us for them to come back home healthy and fit.
We are really happy that you are back home. We feel for the people of Sudan who are experiencing a terrible conflict, and we pray that that conflict will end, but we are happy that you are back home. There are 51 of you who have come back, who are here today, and we had more who arrived yesterday on a commercial airline.
We're home, we're safe. Families are all excited to travel home. We need a few days to recover from this. I had bombs going off over my head. The area I was in, Khartoum 2, was the worst hit. That was like close to the presidential palace, and it was terrible. I mean, we had sleepless nights. Until such time last Sunday, we had to make a break and try and get all the South Africans together, coordinate this thing, and get out of there. But it seems like I just came out of a movie. That's what it seems like. It was just horrendous. The bus trip to the border was treacherous. We drove to the Sahara Desert. It was just no food.
Russia has evacuated more than 200 people from Sudan, according to its defense ministry, which adds that among the evacuated are citizens of Russia and its neighbors. The ministry reported on a Telegram messaging app, quote, 4 Il-76 aircraft of the Russian Aerospace Forces are bringing home more than 200 people from the Republic of Sudan to the Russian Federation. U.S. government facilitated convoys successfully enabled groups of U.S. citizens, their family members, and nationals from partner countries to arrive safely in Port Sudan. The State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel says the convoy has assisted over 700 people. Patel told reporters that the further convoys will depend on the security situation in the region.
U.S. government-facilitated convoys successfully enabled groups of U.S. citizens, their immediate family members, nationals from allied and partner countries to arrive safely in Port Sudan on April 29th, April 30th, and today. These convoys have assisted over 700 individuals. We unfortunately don't have a further breakdown at this moment. From there, we have been assisting U.S. citizens and others who are eligible with onward travel to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where additional U.S. personnel are positioned to assist with consular and emergency services. In a multinational effort, the U.S. government, in concert with allies and partners, has facilitated the departure of over 1,000 U.S. citizens from Sudan since the start of the violence. This effort has included intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance overwatch, close coordination with partner nations on flights and convoys, and a sustained diplomatic and messaging effort to approximately 5,000 U.S. citizens who have sought our guidance. For those among them who have sought our assistance to depart, we are working tirelessly and around the clock to ensure those who have sought our assistance in Sudan that they are aware of all options for evacuation. We continue to call on Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to end the fighting that is endangering all civilians, and we reiterate our warning to U.S. citizens not to travel to Sudan.
United Nations officials say that more than 100,000 refugees have now crossed from Sudan to neighboring countries to escape the conflict that erupted last month, while hundreds of thousands have been displaced by violence within the country. The International Organization for Migration spokesman Paul Dillon said that 334,053 people have so far been internally displaced within the country since April the 15th. Speaking at the same briefing, the spokesman for the World Health Organization, Tariq Jazarik, said there was a moderate risk related to the seizure of a public health laboratory in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, by one of the warring parties.
So over 100,000 refugees are estimated to be among those who have now crossed to neighboring countries, including Sudanese refugees, South Sudanese returning, and other nationalities who were themselves refugees in Sudan. Alongside governments and partners, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has determined an initial planning figure of more than 800,000 refugees and returnees that may flee Sudan to neighboring countries.
At least 334,000 people have been internally displaced within Sudan as a result of the fighting since the 15th of April, according to IOM's Displacement Tracking Matrix Network report, which was released last night and has been disseminated to media here in Geneva. The number of displaced people through the last 2 weeks exceeds, as a result of conflict, exceeds all conflict-related displacements reported in Sudan in 2022. Just to give you a sense of the scale of movement since April 15.
We did a risk assessment of the situation, and the risk has been seen as moderate. And this is because the lab cannot provide its main function, and that's to provide the analysis and the diagnostics because of the lack of fuel and lack of trained staff. What we should really keep in mind that really the biggest health risk for Sudanese people right now is the conflict itself, where health workers and patients cannot access health facilities. Those health facilities are not available. So really the lack of access to health services, this is the main risk.
And since fighting broke out in Sudan between two rival military factions almost 3 weeks ago, hundreds have been fighting in Khartoum, in neighboring countries there. But let's talk to security expert David Otter, who joins me now from Abuja to give us details on this. Hello, David, and thank you for joining us on The World Today.
Thank you.
It's the third week of clashes in Sudan, as we know, and fighting shows no sign of abating. What do you make of all of these happening right now?
I think one key lesson that, African countries, perhaps the African Union has to learn is, what I describe as the second order effect or the third order effect. Yes, there has been intensive clashes between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces, which began on the 15th. But what has exacerbated the situation is this, knee-jerk reaction in terms of evacuation. And what that has done which has not been mentioned, is the fact that it has expanded the battlefield space, in Sudan, especially in Khartoum, whereby, the precision that, was being exercised before by both parties is no longer, of course, most countries have now evacuated
now,
their citizens, and a lot of people have left, Khartoum into... Go ahead.
Yeah, you can just go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, the impact of, this, what I call the second and third order effect, it's quite what, African Union has to look into, because, of course, what we have now is not just people that have been evacuated, but we have the impact on people that have not been able to leave Sudan. They are now being hit more harder. And, other countries that are quite volatile in the region, receiving hundreds and thousands of people fleeing the country. So I think there has to be a key lesson just in the beginning of my statement, that we need to learn how to manage conflict. And, African countries need to understand that, efforts have to be made, to de-escalate, not escalate conflict. Because right now, there is a high level of escalation, despite, both sides reaching to a 7-day ceasefire agreement, which, of course, I think is not going to be as effective as they put it.
The United Nations already said that more than 100,000 people have fled Sudan since the heavy fighting began. But how much of an impact does this have on neighboring countries who are taking in these refugees? We know that Chad is receiving a whole lot of refugees. What's the implication of
I think the impact is the neighboring countries. But first of all, talking about the impact that it has on Sudanese who are unable to flee, who have nowhere to go beyond Khartoum. You've got to think about those who are in direct contact, with this indiscriminate fighting between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. Now, going to the region, Sudan is surrounded by 7 volatile states. Libya is in chaos. There is an ongoing war between in Ethiopia and, the Tigray region. You talk about Chad with instability with the rebels. Eritrea, it's not nothing good to write about. Central African Republic and Chad, all these nations are quite volatile. And what we're experiencing now is just, a movement, a massive movement of people away from Khartoum. But what would happen next, could be more devastating, because we could have weapons being smuggled into these same routes. So the impact is quite devastating. And we must, again, learn how to manage conflict in Africa in order not to destabilize, more states than we ought to.
And what do you think should be done now that's already being done, or maybe something that has not been done, to end this whole rift between both parties and for them to even come to the negotiating table?
I think one of the biggest problems that we're experiencing now is, what I call an over-engagement, with, warring parties. So we've got to have a coordinated plan in terms of how to, reach out to the generals of General Abuhan, for example, of this, the Sudanese Armed Force, and General Dagalo or Hemeti of the Rapid Support Forces. There has to be a coordinated plan. What we're having now is, for example, the African Union, the IGAD, perhaps, South Sudan is putting up, its own approach. You have Egypt, calling for these leaders to come to talk. Saudi Arabia is also pushing the United States, the UN. So all these uncoordinated approaches are just, creating more confusion and making matters worse. Now, in terms of, an immediate ceasefire or an immediate solution, I think the best approach would be, for both leaders, to be reached to by an organized, conflict management approach, perhaps by the African Union. They need to be reached to and reconciled, so that Sudanese can go back to a democratic process which was planned for 2024.
All right. Thank you very much, security expert David Otto, speaking to us from Abuja. Thanks a lot for your contribution on the program. And when we come back, we have more for you on the other stories from around the world on The World Today. Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today. Now, away from Sudan, some Palestinians are protesting after a prominent Palestinian militant died in Israeli custody after an 87-day hunger strike, the first such fatality in more than 3 decades. And tensions around Gaza continue to rise as his Islamic Jihad faction swore revenge. According to Israel's prison service, Kadar Adnan, who was waiting trial, was found unconscious in his cell and taken to the hospital where he was declared dead after efforts to revive him, adding that he had previously refused the service's medical care. His wife, Randa Musa, called for a peaceful response, saying, "We do not want to see any bloodshed." Since 2011, Adnan had conducted at least 3 hunger strikes in protest at detentions without charges by Israel. The tactic has been used by other Palestinian prisoners, sometimes en masse, but the last hunger strike who succumbed was in 1992. According to the Palestinian Prisoners Association, Adnan had been arrested by Israel 12 times, spending around 8 years in prison, mostly under so-called administrative detention or detention without charges. The bodies of 7 people, including 2 missing teens and a convicted sex offender, have been found on a property near the small Oklahoma city. The county sheriff reported that corpses believed to be 14-year-old Ivy Webster and 16-year-old Brittany Brewer were found when officers searched the property where the sex offender Jesse McFadden lived. The county sheriff added that the bodies likely included McFadden and members of his family. The county issued an Amber Alert early on Monday saying the 2 teens were missing, but that alert was called off after the bodies were found. Authorities arrived at about 3 p.m. to search for the property and found the bodies.
At 1500 hours, we arrived out here with a search warrant. We've searched the property and we've located 7 bodies that we are in the process of trying to get the ME to be able to confirm identities of these individuals that were found. We're not going to discuss any of the facts of the case or anything like that, but we are no longer looking. We have believed to have found everything that we were seeking this morning. Our hearts go out to the families and friends, schoolmates. We believe that we have found the persons. We just are waiting for confirmation.
A special coronation vestments, some of which have not been worn in 70 years since the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, are being prepared to be used during the crowning of King Charles later this week. 2 significant historic garments in particular, known as the Super Tunica and Imperial Mantle, will take center stage during the ceremony.
Behind me are some of the most historic and important textiles in the royal collection, and these are 2 of the most significant pieces worn by the sovereign during the investiture, with which the sovereign is invested. And so the first one is the Super Tunica, and that takes the form of an open garment with sleeves, which is also known as the pall of cloth of gold. It is woven from cloth of gold and embroidered with goldwork embroidery to a design which has a strong tradition. And in terms of its history, it's based on ecclesiastical garments, and so it has a symbolic meaning from ancient tradition of the organization of coronations. Over this is worn the final piece of investiture clothing, and that is the Imperial Mantle. This one was made for King George IV in 1821 and was worn at the coronations of King George V, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, and will be reworn again on the day of the coronation.
And finally, on the program, for fashion lovers, all eyes were at the 2023 Met Gala in New York, the United States. The invitation-only Met Gala, famed for its A-list celebrities and extravagant outfits, is a benefit for New York's Metropolitan Museum of Arts, and it marks the opening of the Costume Institute's annual fashion exhibit. This year's gala honors the work of late designer Karl Lagerfeld.
The Metropolitan Museum of Art is celebrating both the work and life of late designer Karl Lagerfeld. Pieces from the famed haute couture designer make up this year's exhibit for the museum's Costume Institute. Celebrities of various kinds walk the star-studded carpet of this year's Met Gala in New York. Actress, singer and dancer Jennifer Lopez dazzled on the Met Gala carpet in a Ralph Lauren pink and black gown.
Jen, right here!
American rapper Cardi B donned in black and white dress and a grey hair wig.
Cardi! Clear the frame! Clear the frame! Yeah. Cardi, right in the middle. Cardi, right here. Hi, Cardi. Cardi, can you start with us down here? Yes, Cardi, yes! Look at this way! Cardi, right in front of you.
American tennis player Serena Williams confirmed she is expecting baby number 2. The 23-time major winner announced last year that she was evolving away from tennis, writing in a Vogue magazine article that she wanted to grow her family after welcoming daughter Olympia in 2017.
Thank you. And right on top, right on top. And to the right again.
Basketball star Brittany Griner arrived with her wife, Cheryl Griner. The 2-times Olympic gold medalist was released from one of Russia's most notorious penal colonies in the high-profile prisoner exchange with the United States late last year after she was arrested in February 2022. Arriving at the annual event, which benefits the Metropolitan Museum of Art Costume Institute, Brittany Griner wore a long cream coat and wide leg pant, while Cheryl Griner wore a white strapless column dress. A touch of indigenous culture was one of the highlights on the look model Kwana Chasenhorse chose for this year's Met Gala.
I think it's really important that we are able to highlight different cultures, because I know Carl had such a great love and passion for just bringing out, different diversity in not just the models, but with what he does. And I just wanted to, tap into my indigeneity and just kind of bring that forward with, of course, some inspiration behind Carl and his legacy.
Speaking of extra, American actor and singer Jeremy Pope wowed the crowd with a 30-foot cape and had a portrait of Karl Lagerfeld on it. The Balmain designed look took 5 people to move it up the Metropolitan Museum of Art steps.
Thank you. My man, right here.
Meanwhile, singer Rihanna ascended the Metropolitan Museum of Art steps, telling reporters that she was feeling expensive in all white, with a Valentino gown covered an extra-large camellia at the Met Gala.
Yeah, right here. Nah, would have been better.
While many celebrities came out in unique and stunning looks, Doja Cat remained faithful and loyal to her stage name as she stunned in a creative full feline makeup. The theme of this year's gala was Karl Lagerfeld, a line of beauty, in honor of the late Chanel designer Karl Lagerfeld.
Yeah! Hey, there you go. Right in front of you.
On that note, we end The World Today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Mwawadu.